Okay, I left you last time with a question. We're talking about free will, and I asked whether God has free will. And there were two natural intuitions about the subject, which conflict with one another, which is always good for philosophy. One was, well, we described freedom as free from external causation. We said if somebody pushes Fred down the stairs, then his breaking the vase at the bottom isn't free will because he was pushed. He didn't make any decision on the issue. And if he received a post-hypnotic suggestion without asking for it, and it caused him to do something later, again, he's not responsible for what happened because his free will had nothing to do with the outcome. So freedom we meant was freedom from external causation. If that's the definition of freedom, then God is free in spades. Nothing causes God. Nothing pushes God around. Nothing forces God to do something. God's existence and operation is totally independent of other factors that could cause anything about him. On the other hand, we think of free will, and we use this in the argument about foreknowledge of free will, we think of free will as choosing between alternatives. If two alternatives, A and B, I could do A and I could do B, they're both under my control, they're both within my power, and then it's my decision that determines which one happens, and I could have, by my decision, have chosen the other one. Now, if that's what we mean by free will, or it's at least implied by free will, it sounds hard to say that about God. God, we think, has certain standards built in. God doesn't choose between justice and injustice, between good and evil, between efficient and less efficient, generous and less generous. We expect God, being all good and being all powerful, to always do the best. Maybe there are select circumstances under which two things are equally best. That could be. But that's rare, and the vast majority of what God does, we're not talking about that kind of choice. So, that being the case, that description of free will, that there be alternatives that are open and both possible, isn't going to be satisfied. So, now to sort of lead into the answer, not everything we say about our free will is going to be true of God. And the question is, so what? We do know that one thing that we say about ourselves is true of God. For us, free will requires freedom from external causation, and God is free from external causation in absolute terms. So that part we share with him, or he shares with us. But the other part, two alternatives, both of which are possible, and our choice determines the outcome, that we don't share. How damaging is that? How serious is that? What conclusion should we draw about God's free will from the fact that he doesn't share with us that feature? Okay, the question is clear? I think it's not damaging at all, and I'll tell you why. Because this feature of our situation, which last time I called free choice, as opposed to free will, is not part of the definition of free will. It's the answer to an engineering problem, which threatens free will. It's not what free will is, it's the way of engineering that free will should be operative in our case. So I'll explain it as follows. Free will means free from external causation. Well, we are creatures. We are created by God. And we are sustained, our existence is sustained by God. And the whole of the natural world in which we live is sustained by God. The problem for human beings is maybe God's activity crowds out any free will for people. How do we get released from God's causation? The fact that I breathe, the fact that my nerve endings are transmitting signals, the fact that my body temperature, all of that is God's causation. Where is there in me a corner where God's causation doesn't swamp me? The problem here is to avoid being swamped by God's activity so that everything that I do and everything that I am is a result of God's causation. Now, the way that's engineered is to put alternatives in front of a human being and for God to withdraw or to fail to activate his causation to determine which outcome shall take place and leave it up to the human being so that which way he goes is something that originates in him, not something that's a result of God's pushing him and forcing him. That's how the human being gets freedom from external causation, because the problem is God's causation that would otherwise swamp him. So having two alternatives and being the human being be the determinant as to which one takes place is not the definition of freedom, it's how a human being escapes divine causation. The question of escaping external causation doesn't arise for God. God escapes external causation in spades. He is what he is of necessity, and nothing else can have any effect on it whatsoever. So I don't need the engineering solution for God. I only need it for human beings to prevent divine causation overwhelming him, swamping us. That's why I think the fact that God doesn't have two different alternatives in front of him is not something which damages the description of his having free will. Are we together? Okay, now I want to ask an objection on this and show you how to respond to it, and then I'll be finished with it from my side. Now, when we say, let's say a person has an addiction. Okay, addiction is a very complicated subject, a very tricky subject. But it's like he has an overpowering desire to something where there's nothing else he can do. He's just programmed that he can't do otherwise. Or in a situation like putting your hand in the fire, which you're just not going to do. It's not a choice. It's something which you're just not going to do. We feel that if we don't have two alternatives, and we don't make a choice between two alternatives, we feel like we're not freely choosing. We talk about inner compulsion. We say, I couldn't help it. That means to say, I'm sort of out of control. I really didn't want to do it, but I couldn't help it, so I'm overmastered by some inner push. That inner push isn't external causation, we think. It's inner, it's part of my character, it's part of my psychology. But it wipes out the alternative, the one that mentally I would have preferred because it's the right thing to do. It wipes it out so that I can only do this, and I plead innocence because I couldn't have done otherwise. So when we say those words, intuitively we're thinking about our inner state, our inner condition. I want to suggest that those thoughts are appropriate, but they're based on something else. Because if I think of myself, okay, here I am, and I know I ought to do A, but my drive is for B, my push is for B, my impulse is for B, and I'm not controlling it, and maybe I even claim that I can't control it, which is hard to prove, but let's say it's true, I can't control it. I want to say the ultimate excuse is that, well, if I'm not deciding it, if I'm not making it happen, then it's being done to me by something outside of me. That's the real excuse. The real excuse is that something put me in that state, something put me in that condition, and that's what's responsible, not me. That's just like a push down the stairs or just like a post-hypnotic suggestion. Really, the only question is freedom from external causation. And the idea of having two choices, being able to choose one or the other, is just how you avoid external causation. And I think proof is too strong a word, but I have an indication of this in the fact that we already discussed cases which are really the opposite, where I'm in a situation where I can't do otherwise. I really can't do otherwise. It's beyond my capacity to do otherwise. And I am responsible. because my own prior free choices put me in that condition. Then I know that it's not external. So, for example, the guy who gets drunk and then drives his car and smashes a tree or smashes into a person, and he says, listen, I didn't want to smash into the person. I didn't choose to smash into the person. I was blind drunk. True, you didn't want to, and you didn't choose to, but your drinking put you in a position where you don't have free will. So your loss of free will in the driving is due to your own free choices beforehand, and because that's the cause of it, that's why you're responsible. Okay, so then, in the case where I want to say I couldn't help it, nothing else I could do, it's got to be that the fact that at the moment of choice I couldn't do otherwise shouldn't be my fault, shouldn't be the result of my prior decisions, because if it were, I would be responsible. Well, if it's not the result of my prior decisions, then it's coming from something else. My DNA, or my childhood training, or my starvation, or whatever it is, and that being the case, it's an external cause. So the ultimate thing that deprives me of responsibility is the fact that I'm tracing it to an external cause. And that really is the definition of freedom. This last part I didn't have before, but as I'm speaking, I think it works out very well now, even better than I thought. That since, if my free choices were the things that led me to being incapable of choosing, I am responsible even when I can't choose. So if I use the fact that I can't do otherwise as an excuse, it must be because it wasn't my free choices that led to me being in that situation where I couldn't choose otherwise. And if it's not my free choices, then it's something else, something outside of me. I think that's even better than I thought. That's what I want to say about God's having free will. Are we together? Good. Now, you'll have to help me with my memory. I'm trying to remember. Did I talk to you about using your free will to end your free will? No. Well, this is very, very important. What would we say about a person who trains himself habitually? There's a certain challenge that he faces, and sometimes he succeeds, sometimes he fails, but he works on it. And he can use behavioral training or cognitive therapy, or he can do it on the basis of his own struggles. And after years of effort, he gets to the point where it's just not a choice anymore. He's ingrained the habit to the extent where he no longer feels any pull whatsoever to the wrong behavior. And he now functions without choice, without temptation, without struggle, doing the right thing. So the first question he could ask is that good? Isn't the glory of the human being that he makes free choices? He's using his free will to cancel out at least part of his free will. He's sort of making himself into a robot. Take that to the extreme. Let's say he robotizes the whole repertoire of his behavior altogether. Wouldn't that mean that he ceases to be human? He ceases to be an object of moral judgment and spiritual value? If he overcomes his free will entirely and ends up with no free will? Now, 90 seconds ago I answered that, right? You know the answer. I know you know the answer. Yeah. 90 seconds ago I answered that. Okay, tell them what I said.
No, I'll let you know the better words.
Let's go back to the drunken driver. Right? What did we say about the drunken driver? Although he chose to put himself in a position where he has no free will, I shouldn't say although, he chose with no free will. The thing that he did with no free will, he's responsible for because his prior choices led him to be in that position. Well, what if we reverse just the values of it? His prior choices put himself in a position where now he always does the right thing. Doesn't he get credit for that since his free choices put him in that condition? So he does get credit for it. He does get credit for it. So then maybe you'll say, okay, that's true. He chose, he gets credit, but he's not using more free will to create new habits or to conquer new realms. So to that we could say maybe he is. And indeed, I think this is very realistic about human development. There are problems that you struggle with at the age of 11, or the age of 16. By the time you're 35, you won't think about them anymore. Children steal. It's very common. And sometimes they go through a period of stealing of 2, 3, 4 years. But they, as we say, outgrow it. They know that it's wrong, and they struggle with themselves for a while. And either through the successive victories that they have in the struggle, and or just growing and maturing and coming to see the world in a different way. And then he's 18 years old, and he's there in the candy store, and the guy goes to the back to answer the phone. I could fill my pockets and run. But it doesn't occur to him to fill his pockets and run. That's what an 11-year-old does. An 18-year-old doesn't do that. So that means that the free will that he used to struggle when he was 12, not to steal at the candy store, that free will is now available for something else, like davening with kavanah, or visiting people in the hospital, or other things that he wants to now add to his repertoire. So the fact that your free will creates a robotic performance of good doesn't mean the free will goes on holiday. It means you have just so much free will, you have just so much psychic energy, so you were using it for X. Now X is programmed, it takes care of itself. So then you can use it for Y and conquer new areas. I think that's common in human development. So you don't have to even lose the activity, and then it can come to a point where all of what you do you're responsible for, and usually because there's a split, some of it you program with your free will to do, and some of it your free will is not actively engaging and deciding to do the right thing, and you become responsible for everything. Whereas when you start out, there's a lot you're not responsible for. There are a lot of things you do because you were trained to do them, or because your desires and pain and pleasure push you to do them, and you don't have certainly consistent free will control of them. Sometimes you lose, and then more and more is conquered by your free will. And in a Jewish system, there's a hierarchy that goes on infinitely to more challenges to cover. So you'll always be active in your progress using free will. Yeah.
So that could be considered as when a person makes teshuva out of love, that when those forces that were pulling the person to do certain things, now they become strengths that give let's say more power to his free will, good choices. So that could be somehow like the power of teshuva.
Okay, so this is a very interesting subject. It's and I encourage at the beginning. I encourage the digression. So the Gemara says something very interesting. It says that tshuva, which is called repentance, but it's much more than that. Tshuva is what you do when you failed, and you regret what you've done, and you resolve to change your future behavior, and you confess it to God, and it's against another person. You have to ask him for forgiveness. When you go through that process, you then are no longer guilty of or punished by what you've done wrong. Well, the Gemara has a refinement to that idea, and it says it depends upon your motivation when you do tshuva. And the Gemara considers two possibilities: that you do tshuva out of awe and fear for God, or you do tshuva out of love of God. And it says the motivation that you have for doing tshuva determines the outcome. If you do tshuva out of awe and fear for God, then those deliberate transgressions for which you are doing tshuva become as if they were accidental and unintentional. Unintentional. I'll come back to that in a minute. It's called shogeg in Hebrew. Whereas if you do tshuva out of love, then the deliberate transgressions become as if they were mitzvos. That's really quite striking. Something which was a transgression, bad, could even use the sonorous word evil, now becomes good. So that requires a certain amount of explanation. Now, I'm going to give you an explanation. I want you to understand that I'm only explaining half. One half I'm taking for granted. That action's in the past. It's in the history book. You're going to do something now that changes the character of the past? Well, that's a mystery. Good, fine, it's a mystery. I'm not talking about that. The verses in Isaiah indicate that it's a mystery. I'm not talking about that. Take that for granted. Somehow, what you do now can change the character of what it was in the past. But what's the linkage? That if you do tshuva out of awe and fear, then it becomes as if it was unintentional. Still wrong. Still wrong. Just unintentional. Much less serious. Whereas if you do tshuva out of love, it becomes as if it's something good, which is shocking and astonishing. And I think the answer is that what you do is you take the person after tshuva and you project him back on the action and see where he, as a new agent with a new character, would relate to that old action. What kind of connection would he have? And that determines how God transmutes the character of that past action. So, let's think about the psychology of doing tshuva out of awe and fear. Oh, those bacon cheeseburgers. I mean, you guys probably don't know. Well, maybe you do. Well, for me, it was lobster. Lobster was just absolutely terrific. It was wonderful. It was very, very delicious. I really enjoyed it. Now, lobster? Wow, you got to be kidding. The creator of the universe doesn't want that. It's just crazy to go against the creator of the universe. And besides, there are penalties also. It doesn't promise ice cream sodas for going after eating lobster. So, I'm not going to do that. Where am I? Where am I? I would still enjoy lobster. If there was special dispensation on the third Thursday of the fourth month of the year, I'd be at the lobster restaurant. No question about it. But there isn't, so I'm not doing it. I'm not doing it because I have awe for God, I have fear for God, for myself. Right? I don't do it. I'm a divided person. My desire for lobster is still there. My desire for doing the wrong thing is still there. But I'm a divided person. And now the better part of me is taking precedence, and I'm doing the right thing. So, how could it be, given my present state of mind, how could it be that I ended up eating a lobster? Only by mistake. I couldn't do it deliberately, because awe and fear of God would stop me. So, it could be a mistake. It could be that I was sloppy in investigating, but it couldn't be deliberate. So God, so to speak, now transmutes the deliberate transgression of the past into something that's unintentional, because I now am the kind of person who could only do it unintentionally. I couldn't do it deliberately. That's awe and fear. What about love? The problem with awe and fear from the point of view of love is that I'm a divided person. Part of me isn't involved in the relationship with God. Part of me is really opposing the relationship with God, just that I'm keeping it under control. Love doesn't tolerate that. If you'll be in love with someone, maybe you have been, maybe you will be, and you think, okay, we're in love and we care for each other very much, but I can't tell, in our case, I can't tell her about X. I can't tell. I can't share that with her because who knows what she'll think, and I don't know what the reaction will be, and it's too precious for me to risk it. So I have to keep it a secret. That's painful because love wants to be an all-encompassing relationship, an all-encompassing bonding. So, since we are commanded to love God, a person who is in the state with the lobster that I spoke about, where I'm not going against the creator of the universe, and I'm not going to risk going to Gehenna. I'm not doing it. There's something unsatisfactory about that. Because the part of me that wants the lobster is still opposing it. Now, love requires, like you said, love requires drawing even the desire for lobster into the love of God and the relationship with God. How do we do that? So let me take some other examples first, and then I'll show you what I think about this example as well. Let's take impulses that lead people to do bad things, and then you can change the circumstances so that the very same impulses can be used for good. Let's take Peter. Peter grew up on the wrong side of the tracks in Chicago, and well, that's called Reuven. Reuven grew up, and he became a member of a local youth gang, and because he was Jewish, he fought his way to the top. I didn't say that. Because he managed to become the leader of the gang, and he led them on their exploits, blowing up buildings and kidnapping people, and fine. For one reason or another, Reuven ends up in the army. The American army, he's open to a new world. First of all, he's taught self-discipline. He's taught line of authority. He sees the value of joint projects where people can trust one another and they do things that are really important. He learns a profession for himself, and he can now earn an honest living, and he sees a new life for himself. And he's thinking, okay, I got this degree, and I could do various things. He goes to the police academy and says, listen, I want to become a police officer, and I want to go into youth assignments, because I know it well. I've been there. I've done that. I lived that. I know what they want. I know what drives them. I know what their strategies are. Assign me to the youth corps, and I'll do a good job. Because he was the leader of a gang and did all those criminal actions, he can now work with youth gangs and help them. Had he not had that experience, he wouldn't have been able to do it, or not nearly as well. And the same impulses, I see them doing this, they have this, the cars are over there. What's their next thought? And he thinks, well, what would I think? I would think, go for the cars. Okay, that's where they're going. He's using his impulses to read what they're going to do, anticipate it, and be able to deal with them. So he's elevating what was before negative. He's bringing his anti-social impulses into his dedication to the good. You can do a similar thing with respect to anti-Torah impulses. You can incorporate them into the service of the good without destroying them, without simply just opposing them. With yira, with awe and fear, you oppose and squash it. Here you find a way to, as the psychologist will say, sublimate it, or incorporate it into your service of Hashem. So, for example, one of the Amoraim, I think, said, I only go to a Suda when it's a Suda's mitzvah. A full-fledged meal rather than a snack. I only go when they're celebrating something. The finishing of a Masechta, or a bris, or a Pidyon HaBen, or some other mitzvah. That's when I go because I'm participating in celebrating a mitzvah. So the fact that I enjoy food, I'm not saying this is what the Aurora say, but I'm giving an example, that I enjoy the food, it's a mitzvah to enjoy the food when you're celebrating a mitzvah. So I'm making a mitzvah out of my enjoyment of the food. I'm taking the enjoyment of food, instead of putting a heavy dose of pepper in all my food so I don't enjoy it. No, I'm using the enjoyment of the food as a mitzvah. The same thing's true, let's say, with impulses to do something that's wrong. I'll give you just an example, and then I'll show you how it applies. The President of the United States realizes that one of his chief diplomats has been taken captive by a terrorist gang. He calls in the Navy SEALs. He says, listen, this is where they are. This is how we have to get there. I need 6 of you. There are 100 in the room. I need 6 of you to go after them. You could see it's dangerous. You might get killed. You might get captured. I'm asking for volunteers. Would anybody volunteer? It's dangerous. He might get killed. He might get captured. Yeah, but I'm a Navy SEAL. That's what I was trained for. That's what I'm good at. I'm the only one, we the 100 in the room are the only ones in the country who could actually do this. I signed up for this because I want to make this kind of contribution. So sure, they're going to volunteer. Because that's where the meaning of their lives exists. Now, let's say the person, let's go back to lobster. See, they've got a new anti-lobster injection. I'm not talking about vaccines now and the reliability of vaccines. No, I'm just giving you an example, right? An anti-lobster injection. You won't have to struggle anymore. We'll give you the injection. You won't want it anymore. And then you can just kiss it goodbye. Part of me says, wait a minute. If I want the lobster and I'm in a condition now where I'm not going to give in, then I can show to HaKadosh Baruch Hu how much I appreciate and how much I want to serve him by resisting the lobster. So resisting the lobster gives me an opportunity. It's not just negative, I want to squash it. If I want to squash it, then I'd be very happy with the injection. If I was only motivated by awe and fear of God, the injection would be perfect. But if I want to draw all the parts of my personality into the service of God, then I won't be happy with losing that part of my personality. So, for example, we say, as I'm sure you know, in the Shema, love God with all your heart. And there, the word for heart is spelled lamed beis beis, extra beis. And lev is the Hebrew, the Tanakhic word for heart. And there is in the Tanakh the word libcha, your heart, with only one base. So when you have two, you know that there's one extra there, and it needs to be explained. And I'll say, love God with both your hearts, with the good inclination, with the evil inclination. Love God with the evil inclination also. That's what we're talking about. Bringing the evil inclination into your service of God. I've given you a couple of examples how to do that. Now, that extra base appears someplace else in Dovid. Umatzasa es levovo neman lefenecha. The verse says God found Abraham's heart faithful before him. And the word for heart there is spelled lamed beis beis, which means God found Abraham's heart, both his good inclination and his evil inclination, faithful before him. Abraham succeeded in doing this and bringing his evil inclination into his service of God. Whereas King David writes about himself in Psalms, in Tehillim, Libi cholal bekirbi, my heart is empty within me. The oral tradition says that means he killed his Yetzer Hara. He killed his evil inclination. And Yerushalmi says King David killed his evil inclination because he couldn't do what Abraham did. It would have been a higher resolution to incorporate it into his service of God. And I don't know if this was his whole life. In other words, it was a period of time in which he simply turned it off. He couldn't do what Abraham did, so he neutralized it. So this is clearly the higher resolution. And then when you've brought it into your service, it still doesn't mean necessarily you've lost free will, because you have to create the circumstances under which it can be used positively. So it's not as if you've lost free will, but it is a much higher resolution to the dilemma of the past transgression, and both of those are legitimate. Serving God out of awe and fear is definitely legitimate. It's appropriate. The bottom line is that the actions that you do are the appropriate actions, and out of dedication to God. But one should reach for love. Okay, are we together on this? Yeah.
Yeah, so just again, like in the what to do for the situation in which there's this scenario that would create the conditions for acting upon the evil inclination, and yet, I mean...
So I'll tell you, it depends upon how far you're out of control. Often, when a person is out of control with respect to some behavior, to tell him, no, use it positively, is asking him something impractical. He can't do that. First, he's got to get control to be able to say no. And after he's able to say no consistently, then he can say, I'm going to say yes when it's positive. I think as a process of development, the first step is to be able to say no, and then afterwards to use it positively. That's why I don't remember seeing this in print, but it seems to be reasonable to think that when it says King David that his heart is empty, he killed his Yetzer Hara, that was only temporary. That was the first step in his development, and then afterwards he moved to Abraham's step. I don't think he was that way for the whole of his life. Yeah.
In the context of this specifically, I think I know the answer. It might be related to what you said about David, but why did our sages give up idolatry? It's like taking that injection against the lobster.
You're 100% right. That's a very, very good question. The sages, beginning the Second Temple, asked God to remove the evil inclination for idolatry because they saw that the opportunity and success of withstanding the temptation for idolatry versus the disaster caused by losing the battle with idolatry, it was a losing proposition. Now that's a very bold thing to do. Now they asked God to take it away. God could have said no. Right? They asked God to take it away because they saw it as a losing proposition. But let me add one more factor here, which I think is also very important. We have the pasuk Zeh lo zeh aseh Elokim. God made a double hierarchy of alternatives, possibilities. One hierarchy of good, one hierarchy of bad, and at every level you have the opportunity to choose between them. Nothing's free. Nothing's free. So when God took away the evil inclination for idol worship, the alternative to idol worship, which is supposed to be a choice between them, also was lost. That was prophecy. That was prophecy. So, what do they have in common? So I heard what they have in common is the capacity for self-transcendence. Both real worship of God, of which the highest level is prophecy, the highest level of spiritual attainment in this world is prophecy, which is really attachment to God. That's self-transcendence in spades, because you're attaching yourself to the creator of the infinite creator of the universe. And the self's importance is transcended. It has to be taken with care. What is idol worship? Well, there's some power, and I'm going to dedicate myself to that power, which is also stepping beyond myself. It's just that the way in which you connect yourself to God is you, first of all, have to take an entrance exam for prophet school, and they had B'nai Hanavim, the disciples of the prophets. The Psukim write about them. They were in the hills, and they were off doing prophecy exercises. The entrance exam was the Mesilas Yesharim, the path of the just, to have done it all. That was the entrance exam. And then there was further development to bring you to the point where you could be worthy of prophecy. Well, that's a long, difficult, strenuous task. Whereas idol worship is, you pay your nickel and you drink some scotch and you dance around the fire and you're all in. That's very attractive, You're giving yourself up to something bigger and more powerful and more important. So when they said to God, take away the evil inclination for idol worship, the positive possibility of prophecy was also lost. You don't get prophecy free. There has to be an alternative that you choose between. So it was a loss in that respect. But all things considered, and it's very interesting that we don't have record of idol worship in the Second Temple period, whereas the whole world was still worshiping idols. But in the Second Temple period, you don't have it. So that's the idea of Shuvah Minam and Shuvah V'yira. Now, okay, and then I just want to do one thing. Yeah.
Yeah, short question, Rabbi. If our spiritual goal is to attain prophecy, how can we possibly achieve that if idol worshiping is gone, at least within our ranks?
In this period of history, we can't achieve it. God does not grant it.
In other words, we should strive in that direction, but we know that.
Exactly right. Exactly right. All the commentators agree that you can't bring about prophecy by preparation or by training. You can make yourself worthy of it, and then if God chooses to, He will give you prophecy. But you cannot determine it. All you can do is prepare yourself in the best possible way. There is a level of connection to God. Connection is a matter of degree, and there is a level of connection that's available for us. We are put into a history, and we're given a soul for which this is the highest thing that it needs to accomplish, because nothing else could be accomplished now. So I don't think that we have to worry about that. Now, this idea of using your free will to overcome your free will, this is an idea. Yes, I will take it off. I won't break it. It's really in the Rambam discussing Moses, the Meshech Chochmah, talks about this in his introduction to the book of Exodus. When in the 8th chapter of Yeshivat Torah, the Rambam is talking about the prophecy of Moses and how the prophecy of Moses was different from the prophecy of other people. And Moses' prophecy was inherently superior to that of all of the prophets, because we witnessed his prophecy at Sinai. We heard God speaking to him. And all the other ones we didn't witness. And that being the case, we rely on Moses' criteria for such a prophet, that he is a genuine prophet. I'm sorry, it's Perek Shvi. It's the 7th chapter. Now he says, all the prophets, when they had prophecy, were overwhelmed, shocked. They fell on the ground. They lost control of their bodies and their senses and their minds. Not so with Moses. All the prophets, other prophets, could not demand prophecy. Moses is not like that. Anytime he wanted the Holy Spirit to he enveloped him in the Holy Spirit, and prophecy applied to him, occurred to him, and he doesn't have to work to focus his mind and to prepare himself for it. Because why could Moses do this at any time he wanted? Why was he not like the other prophet? Shaharihu mechuvan umzuman va'omeid. He is continuously focused, aimed, and prepared. Kemalachei Yesharis, just like the ministering angels. Just like the ministering angels. And then he says, the reason for this was because he separated from everything bodily. When the people were told to separate from their wives before the time of giving the Torah, so that the women should be pure. Yes, the men didn't need it for 3 days. Only the women needed it for 3 days. So the women should be pure. And then afterwards, they were given permission to go back to normal family life. It says, God says to Moses, you should stay here with me. So the Rambam says, he disconnected himself from family life and all similar things. His mind was fixed on the rock of the worlds. The glory did not depart from him forever. His face shined with that heavenly light. And he became holy, ka malachim, like the angels. Twice in 10 lines, the Rambam says that Moses was like the angels. Angels have no free will. Angels have no free will. Says the Meshech Chochmah. From here you see that Moses lost his free will. You'll tell me, like I said at the beginning, but then he's lost his purpose of being a human being? No. He overcame free will by using his free will to train himself to the point where there was no competition, there was no desire that would draw him in the wrong direction. And that being the case, he gets credit for doing it. That's the highest achievement. That's the highest achievement. And the Mesilas Yesharim, Lutzato, which has 26 chapters, you can guess why. In the 26th chapter at the end, says that holiness means to become like an angel. So it's the same word. And the Ramchal knew the Rambam. Now, I've told you that from the Meshech Chochmah and from the Ramchal, because I would like to break a prejudice, which I'm sure some people have, and if there's people who are listening to this on the recording, because this is also said by the Baal HaTanya, the founder of Chabad Hasidism. Well, according to Baal HaTanya, there are three categories of people. A Rasha, listen carefully, a Rasha is someone who sometimes does something wrong. A Beinoni, intermediate, is someone who never does anything wrong. That's intermediate, but he struggles. He could do something wrong and he always wins the struggle. And a tzaddik is a person who has no free will. He could not do anything wrong. He's already become programmed with doing the right thing. And that's the highest level. So there are people with these terrible, debilitating prejudices. If I had started with the Baal HaTanya, say, oh, that's Hasidim, and that's Chabad. We don't do that. We don't think about that. But if I tell you that the Meshech Chochmah says the Rambam said so, and the Ramchal says so in the Sisha, then maybe you'll be a little bit more open-minded and a little more forgiving and understanding that this is a very, very central idea. So using free will to program oneself to the point where free will is no longer operating, but of course because you're doing the right thing, you're doing the appropriate thing, that's a great goal. It's the most successful spiritual development according to these sources. That's something very important to know about free will. Yeah.
So, hypothetically, if somehow the free will for idol worship would be reinstated, would that bring together also the conditions for prophecy? Like
I would guess so. I would guess so that they would come together. And prophecy will be restored. Whether that's going to come together with idol worship, that depends on the condition of the world to come, of the times of Mashiach. By the way, the same idea that we've used answers another question. People say they've read that in the time of the Mashiach there won't be any free will. So why am I praying for that? Excuse me, I mean, who wants to go there if there's nothing I can do? No, I can't earn any merit, and so forth and so on. Part of the answer is, if I pray for it, I'm bringing it about. And if I'm bringing it about, then I can get credit for all the things I do there. If I'm working to make it happen. Well, that is a very, very important principle in free will, that the consequences of your free decisions you're also responsible for, even if those consequences are not the exercise of free will. Yeah.
When it talks about using kind of free will to end struggles and thereby lose, free will in some areas, the arena simply shifts to whatever the next area is. Now, unlike the tzaddikim, who have conquered pretty much all of that, but isn't there still free will being applied at some level to constantly orient yourself to Hashem, and that's a free will choice?
Not according to this, no. The Malachim don't require any effort to focus themselves on Hashem. They're created that way.
But that's the Malachim.
But then he's saying that Rambam says twice that Moshe made himself like the Malachim.
Moshe.
Well, okay, I'm talking. Okay, but so what? But so what? I don't care if he's on a different level. The point is, what do you look forward to for humanity?
Well, that's why he says like the Malachim, not like. It's a comparison. It's not on the level of the Malachim. It's close.
So you say, but there's no reason to say that. He's not a Malach because he has a goof. So he's not identical to a Malach. But he made himself with a goof like what the Malachim are.
But he chooses to serve God where the angels had no choice.
Correct. That's history. That's what he did. He chose to make himself that way. But he chose to make himself that way to the point where he's no longer choosing.
Like an autopilot.
And he's like the Malachim in that he's not choosing. But he didn't get there in the same way, and he's not constituted the same way. That's enough to give a kaf dimion, to say only like. Right? But that doesn't mean that the quality of what he's doing is only similar to, but not equal to. There's no reason to say that.
So it's not a kind of like a maintenance level where it's still like everything's there as far as the struggle's ended. But the reason that all of this is happening, the reason why he continues to do this and try to grow, is all in the service.
If the struggle has emptied, then the maintenance is not struggle. If it's not struggle, it's not free will. It doesn't help you.
So there
Can't be maintenance without struggle.
So there has to be some level of struggle, otherwise.
Otherwise, it's not maintenance. It's not, you're not doing anything. Right? The light of the lighthouse goes round and round by itself. Right? It doesn't require, it's on a swivel. It goes around and around. Okay.